All right, guys. So this is one of my favorite modules to teach, and this is our load management module. So load management is something that has been kind of a hot topic the past few years, right? You've seen a lot more professional athletes take their load management a lot more seriously. You're also seeing a lot of coaches in the professional ranks nowadays really kind of rely on load management and kind of rotating their squads to make sure that there's the optimal amount of stress that's going through their athletes' bodies so that they are fatigue resistant and they can last the entire season without getting injured. Okay. So this is where we start talking a little bit about injuries. There is a separate rehab and injury module where we go deep dive into this, but this fits a little bit better during the sport performance module because we're basically preventing injuries with load management. We're not dealing with them. So we're going to start off by talking about a few injury predictors, talking about optimizing stress, and then we're going to talk about something called the acute chronic workload ratio. Super important concept to understand. So the three biggest injury predictors. Number one, previous injury. If you tear your hamstring or you pull your hamstring, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to pull it again in the next 3 to 4 weeks. If you sprain your ankle once, you're 3 to 4 more times more likely to sprain it again. Okay. Fatigue. Fatigue is highly correlated with injury. Most injuries occur at the end of a half or the end of a game in soccer. Okay, so that's that should tell you everything you need to know. If your athletes are fatigued, they're less injury resilient. Okay. And then the third piece is if there's an acute chronic workload imbalance, and we're going to get into that at the very end of this module. But know that it is a very high predictor of injury. Okay. And basically, what this all means is it comes down to stress management. How well do your athletes handle stress and handle load? So for that, we need to really talk about what's called the stress sweet spot, right? If you look at the left side of this graph here, the I'm so bored starting to get my attention. That's what we call underdosing, right? They're not really getting enough of a stressful stimulus. They're not training hard enough to really reap the benefits. Now, if we look at the right side of that, your athletes may start to freak out with the load or they get into this burnout phase. That's an overly stressed athlete, which is going to be just as detrimental, if not more detrimental, than someone who's underloaded. Okay. So, what we're really striving for here is this middle ground, right? This I'm rocking it ground, right? I feel good. I'm challenged. I get tired during my workouts, but I'm able to do it again the next day. That is the sweet spot that we're looking for. So there's quite a few factors, right, that go into this. This isn't just the amount of work that's put on the pitch during your training sessions day in and day out, right? If there's someone who, is needing to have more stress, maybe they're chronically underdosed, right? These are typically the people who have stress resistant genetics, right, as one factor. They're very well practiced at it, right? They're used to the load. They would describe their load as moderate. And in their environment, they're often spending time outdoors. They're spending time actively outside of the training environment, and they love spending their time with their loved ones. They have a strong support network, and they have great coping mechanisms. Right, they're very calm, and they're able to calm themselves down when they're emotional. Right, they have a go with the flow attitude. They're optimistic. They're proactive. They're confident. They view stress as a challenge to rise to versus something that is stacking up against them. That's an ideal person, right? This is the type of person that you can put some more stress on and they can probably handle it. But I would say on the flip side, you're probably going to have more athletes that are probably more stress prone than stress resistant, right? They don't tolerate it well. They haven't had a lot of experience with the amount of load that's required to play at a high performance level. They will either tell you that they have a very low stress or they have a very high stress, right? They're in the position where they're chronically underloaded to where they're not getting any benefit whatsoever, or they're just chronically pushing themselves to the limit and they're overly stressed, right? They usually have little time for things that they enjoy outside of training, and that includes time with family, right? They have a very weak support system around them. They tend to be very highly anxious and overwhelmed by their emotions. They have trouble adapting. They have a poor mindset. They're pessimistic. They often don't seem confident, right? And they see that stress is something to avoid versus something to embrace. These are the people that we have to try and find some balance with, right? We don't want to push these people as far as they can go, but we need to kind of, we kind of need to motivate them a little bit to find that stress sweet spot. And the way that we can do that is through reporting on these acute chronic workload sheets that we're going to go over in a little bit. So coming into the acute chronic workload, this is how we're going to track how stressed your athletes are, right? And you'll see the template of this in the workbook of the questionnaire that your athletes need to be filling out daily for themselves, or checking in with your athletic trainer or with you as the coach every time they see you, okay? So basically what this is their subjective report of their current workload. And if we make this simple, right? If we just gave them a numeric scale and said, hey, how stressed are you today from 0 to 10? 0 is no stress, 10 is I'm about to die, right? Where are you on that scale? Say they say a 7 this week. We want to then compare that to their average, right? So the 7 out of 10 is their acute workload. Their chronic workload is the average score that they've reported over the past 4 weeks. So say you ask them 3 times a week and they're like, I'm a 7, I'm a 6, I'm a 9, I'm a 6, I'm a 5, I'm a 7, I'm a 7, right? And it averages out to 7 out of 10 over the last 4 weeks. Well, if their current week is 7 out of 10, so we call it a 7, their rolling average for the past 4 weeks is also a 7. They have an acute chronic workload of 1.0, and that's ideal. That means they found their stress sweet spot, okay? Now, on the flip side of that, if they come to you and say, man, coach, I'm a 9 out of 10 today. I am stressed, right? I am tired, I'm fatigued. And you look at their rolling average for the last 6 weeks, it's been a 6. So you do a 9 divided by 6, their acute chronic workload ratio is now 1.5. That's really, really high. And that's who you know is needing a rest week. It needs to not be pushed this week. They need to deload because they're about to get injured and they're about to burn out. Okay. So how do we also, make this a little bit more sophisticated, right? We can rely on subjective, right? We can rely on just the subjective. How well do you feel today? But we want to go a step further. We want to be optimal here, right? We want to be premier soccer performers. So we want to break this down into 2 different categories. We want to bring this down into what we call internal and external load, okay? So for internal load, we look at hormonal response, right? So that can be the subjective. That can be the how do you feel today? But we also want reports on sleep. We want reports on nutrition adherence, and we want reports on hydration. So maybe your daily questionnaire for your athletes or your once a week questionnaire for your athletes says, question 1, how stressed do you feel this week 10 out of 10? This week, on average, how many hours did you sleep per night? On average, what percentage of your nutrition habits did you complete this week? On average, how many glasses of water do you drink per day this week? Right? And you can use the exact same formula, right? What is their report this week versus the past 3 or 4 weeks? So now you have a bunch of different categories that can be flagged for acute to chronic workload, and you get a really good sense of how stressed your athletes are. Okay. Now, external load is something that we can also track through a GPS system, right? For those of you who don't know what GPS systems are, this is a heart rate monitor, or the thing that kind of looks like a bra that you're wearing right underneath your shirts when you're training. Basically, that has a little sensor within it that you can plug in and hook up to whatever system you're trying to use. And it will track a bunch of different, very cool performance indicators like speed, the amount of sprints, accelerations, heart rate, all that fun stuff. and it'll give you averages. And you can actually apply the acute chronic workload to any attribute that you can track through GPS. So now if you've got all of this data and information, basically all it's telling you is more reliably, is your athlete too stressed? Are they not stressed enough? Or have they hit their sweet spot? If they hit their sweet spot, keep on doing what they're doing. If they're underdosed, ramp them up. If they're overdosed, shut them down. Give them an off day. Don't let them practice. Take the intensity down, right? This is how we manage injuries, especially during the rigors of an intense season. Okay? The AC ratio, it needs to be as close to 1 as possible. We're okay with it going down between 0.8 to 1.1. Okay, in that range, that's not bad. That's what you probably want to be for your chronic workload ratio. Now, if you're below 0.8, yeah, you're probably underdosed. You need to get a little bit more stress. If you're above 1.1, your athletes are close to getting injured. They need to be shut down for a little bit. And by a little bit, maybe a day or so, right? Nothing crazy. Give them an extra off day. That's all it takes. Let's see here. Okay, so what does the data say on GPS? Now, GPS is something super, super cool. So if you have the budget for it, I highly recommend you get a GPS system. Now, there was this really great study, and we've linked the article here. Basically, it was from the British Journal of Sports Medicine. And what they tracked was 320 youth soccer players who are outfielders, not goalkeepers, 16 to 18 years old. What they wanted to track was the amount of injuries and if those injuries were correlated to certain characteristics of training. It was a really intense study. It was very, very well designed. So they defined injury as a minimum as 1 to 3 days missed. Mild injury was 4 to 7 days missed. A moderate injury was 1 to 4 weeks, and a severe injury was 4+ weeks out. What they found was, of those 320 youth athletes over the time frame that they monitored them, there were 138 injuries. And what they found was that basically equated to 1.2 injuries per 100 hours of training time. Now, if you've got 20 kids on your team, one practice session is 20 hours trained. So that means of a team of 20 kids, you're going to get 1 injury per 5 practice sessions. That's ridiculous, right? Like ultimately, that's basically saying you're going to get 1 injury a week. And you've got 12 weeks in your season if you're in college, maybe 12 if you're split up per season for club. During that, that's 12 injuries in one season. Maybe the same athlete has 3 of those. It accounts for 3 of those injuries. But still, 12 injuries during the course of the season. It's astronomically high. What they found in the study was there's 3 main injuries that occurred. The first one was a ligament sprain, so either an ankle sprain or a ligament in the knee getting sprained or torn. The next most common one was a hematoma, or just a fancy word for a bruise, right? Just a contact injury getting knocked. And then the third most common was a muscle strain. So they tracked on the GPS, right? What are the correlations here? So they found that for total distance in a week, if your athletes are going above 22 to 25 miles a week of running, they're more likely to get injured. So if you have a GPS system and you're tracking this, right, you're basically tracking the 100, like it can be set by typically it's set in meters, not miles. But basically, your total distance needs to be under 112 to 140,000 kilometers, sorry, 100,000 meters. If your athletes are hitting that range, you need to combat that with a low intensity week. So that low intensity week needs to be either 0 to 88,000 meters. Okay, so basically chopping it down by about 30%, 30 to 40% for 1 week. If you do that, they reset, they're no longer an injury risk. The second attribute that they tracked on GPS was high speed running. So the amount of times those athletes got over 20 kilometers an hour. So, and to give you a reference on that, typical top speed for a for an Olympic sprinter is typically around 26, and that's miles per hour. So injuries will occur if you spend more than 3,500 to 5,000 meters in the 20-kilometer plus range per hour range. So if you're sprinting at that speed for more than 3,500 to 5,000 meters per week, you're at an injury risk. To combat that, they have to have an off week of about under 750 meters of high-speed sprinting. The third one, and this one we bolded because it was actually the most talked about and the most statistically significant piece to this. So they tracked the amount of accelerations. So the amount of times that the software that was attached to the person picked up a change in speed, right? Injuries seem to consistently occur if more than 9,500 accelerations happen in a week. Okay. So if that happens for more than 3 weeks, your kids are going to get injured. You need to combat it with 1 week of 700 to 2,800 accelerations. So the way to do that, and it's very cool, GPS actually makes it super easy to track all of this, and you can flag your individual athletes and you can set limits on them. And when they hit those limits, you basically tell them to shut down. That's acute chronic workload management at its finest. So the GPS itself will spit out a coefficient or a value based on the overall stress going through the body. And typically what they find was on the study that they did was injury risk occurs if their total workload went above 649 or went between 475 to 650. So again, it just gives you another measurement to see, hey, they've subjectively reported that they're stressed, that they're not stressed, but their output suggests otherwise, right? It gives you an objective data and not just relying on their word. That's another thing we have to think about here, right? So again, AC ratio, that stress sweet spot, 0.8 to 1.3. 1.3 can be technically kind of borderline, but it should be fine for most athletes. Fatigue injury risk increases at 1.5, meaning non-contact injuries, meaning those dreaded ACLs. And then for contact injuries, meaning, bruises, things like that, those traumatic injuries, they typically increase at 1.7 for your acute chronic workload ratio. Okay, so a lot of good information here in this study. Now, as a side note, we went over the periodization module in this block, right? Progressive undulation. So basically just saying progressive or undulation, right? So basically saying that if you're giving them 3 weeks of high intensity, but you're already planning for 1 deloading week, right? In your periodized overall plan for the year, you can account for this already, right? You can say 3 weeks we're going at it, 1 week we're off. 3 weeks we're going at it, 1 week we're off. And you can use that as part of planning your intensity for your sessions when you plan out the entire year. Again, it all goes back to periodization. This is how it goes hand in hand. If you have someone who's overstressed and needs that break, you got to give them some other things to do right outside of soccer. We got to have them focus on resting, sleeping, hydrating, getting their nutrition right. Meditation is another great tool. I highly encourage all my athletes to download the Headspace app. It's a great way to start getting into meditation and learning all of its benefits. Have them spend time relaxing with their family, their loved ones, their girlfriends and boyfriends, their pets, right? Time away with people that they love or people that they want to be around has a significant effect in the positive direction on stress. Have them do relaxing hobbies, reading. Maybe if they're in school, they don't want to do more reading, maybe some video games. There's no harm in that. And you always want to allow for self-compassion, right? You want to develop an environment within your team and your team culture that allows for this to say, or allows for your athlete to say, I'm tired. I can't do this today. If you force your athletes to work past their stress point, you're doing them a disservice. So we need this culture of normalizing time off if they need it. But that being said, that's not an excuse to not stress yourself appropriately, right? So the best way to do that, again, is workout intensity. If someone needs to be kind of ramped up some more, best way to do that is workout intensity. I always like the habit of a cold shower. If you think about a cold shower, right? Take a normal shower with the water at whatever temperature you like. The last 30 seconds of your shower, turn it to freezing cold and sit there with that uncomfortable feeling, that uncomfortable coldness for 30 seconds. It doesn't seem like much, but it is enough over time to improve resiliency. It improves your immune system, and it makes you a more stress tolerant person. There's a researcher and a guy, his name is Wim Hof, and he's known as, he has this colloquial term on the internet, he's called the Iceman. He's known for these super impressive feats of human stress tolerance in icy conditions. So this is a dude that goes and sits out and meditates in the mountains for hours with no shirt on, right? He lives out in the freaking icy environments for weeks on end with no coats. He survives, no problem, but he's trained his body to be resilient towards that stress. And the very first thing that he recommends that a lot of people should do to become more stress tolerant is doing the cold shower trick every day. So it might be something you suggest to your athletes. Another way to develop someone's stress tolerance is through routine and habit formation. Again, harping on the habits, things that are your individual athletes need to improve upon. So that's it for load management. Again, super interesting topic. We love teaching this stuff. And we love implementing this stuff. You know, at St. Mary's with Johnny and Grant, they've done a great job of implementing GPS and really relying on those statistics. And then comparing it to the research, right? That's how they've had a 0 injury rate last season. They literally had 0 injuries, 0 time loss injuries. They may have had a couple of people pick up a couple of knocks, but no one missed practice because of an injury. And part of that goes down to their work management and their load management strategies. So it is a big game changer. That's for sure. All right, take a little break. We'll see you on the next module.